The summer breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias through the historic neighborhood as Rose and David sat nervously in the elegant living room of his family's mansion. The antique grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, each second feeling like an eternity. Rose's fingers intertwined with David's, drawing strength from his presence. She was about to meet his family for the first time since they'd gotten engaged, and despite her usual confidence as one of the city's most respected pediatric surgeons, her heart was racing. The moment they'd been waiting for arrived as David's mother Grace swept into the room, followed by his father Richard. The air suddenly felt thick with tension. Grace's eyes flickered briefly over Rose before fixing on her son, her smile noticeably strained. Richard stood rigid by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "Mom, Dad," David began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I want you to meet the woman I'm going to marry." He squeezed Rose's hand gently as they both stood up. "This is Rose. She's the most incredible person I've ever met." Rose stepped forward with a warm smile, extending her hand. "It's wonderful to finally meet you both. David has told me so many beautiful stories about this house and the family memories you've created here." Grace's hand was limp as she barely touched Rose's fingers, while Richard simply nodded from his position by the fireplace. The silence that followed was deafening. "So," Grace finally spoke, her voice carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, "this is what you meant by important news." "I must say, David, I'm surprised." The way she said surprised made it clear she meant something entirely different. Rose maintained her composure, though her heart sank. She'd faced prejudice before in her life and career, but something about the cold rejection in Grace's eyes hit differently. This was supposed to be family. "Rose is an incredible pediatric surgeon," David continued, his voice growing stronger with a touch of defiance. "She's saved countless children's lives and—" "A doctor?" "How interesting," Grace interrupted, her tone suggesting it was anything but. She turned to her husband. "Richard, didn't you say the Henderson's daughter just finished medical school? The one you were hoping to introduce to David?" The implication hung heavy in the air. David's jaw tightened. "Mom, I'm in love with Rose. We're getting married this fall, and we hope you'd be happy for us." "This fall?" Grace's perfectly manicured hand flew to her chest. "But that's so soon. Surely you need more time to think things through." Rose took a deep breath and spoke quietly but firmly. "Mrs. Anderson, I know this might be unexpected, but I love your son deeply. We're not asking for your approval, though we'd cherish your blessing. We're here because family means everything to both of us." Grace's face hardened. "Family means everything to us too, dear. Which is precisely why we need to consider what this situation might mean for the Anderson name. We have a certain position in society to maintain." The words cut through the room like ice. David stood up straighter, his arm protectively around Rose's waist. "Our position in society? Mom, it's 2025, not 1950. Rose is brilliant, accomplished, and the woman I choose to spend my life with. That should be all that matters." Richard finally spoke, his voice gravelly with emotion. "Son, you need to understand. There are expectations, traditions." "Traditions of what, Dad? Prejudice? Discrimination?" David's voice cracked slightly. "I expected better from both of you." Grace's face flushed. "I think we all need time to process this. Perhaps it would be best if you left now. We can discuss this development when everyone's had time to think clearly." As they walked to their car, Rose held her head high despite the tears threatening to spill. David's hands shook as he opened the car door for her. Once inside, he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I knew they might be difficult, but I never imagined." Rose reached over and touched his hand. "Hey, look at me. We knew this wouldn't be easy. But we have each other, and that's what matters most." What they didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. News of their engagement spread through David's family like wildfire. His Aunt Catherine, the family matriarch, called an emergency family meeting, one to which neither David nor Rose was invited. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations to family events mysteriously got lost in the mail, and the whispers began. But sometimes the deepest rejection can spark the most powerful love stories. And as Rose and David would soon discover, their journey was about to take an unexpected turn that would shake the very foundations of his family's prejudices. The weeks following their engagement announcement felt like walking through a minefield. Rose sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone, watching as another wedding invitation was met with a polite but cold rejection. This time, it was from David's cousin Jenny, who'd been like a sister to him growing up. The message read, "Prior commitment that weekend. Send my regards." David walked in from work, his tie loosened, looking exhausted. One look at Rose's face told him everything. "Another one?" he asked softly, placing his briefcase down. "Jenny," Rose replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "That makes 15 family members now." She didn't need to count. Each rejection had left its own little mark on her heart. David pulled up a chair beside her, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I ran into Uncle Peter at the courthouse today," he said. "He literally turned around and walked the other way when he saw me coming." Rose reached for his hand. "Maybe we should just have a small wedding. Just my family, our friends." "No," David said firmly. "We're not going to let them make us feel ashamed. This is supposed to be our happiest day." Just then, Rose's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby, just saw Grace at the supermarket." She pretended not to see me and switched aisles. Rose felt tears welling up. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. These people were supposed to become her family, and they couldn't even look her mother in the eye at the grocery store. The next day at the hospital, Rose threw herself into her work, trying to push aside the pain. She was in the middle of explaining a procedure to a worried mother when she heard a familiar voice in the hallway. It was Grace, David's mother, talking to someone. Rose's heart dropped. She hadn't seen Grace since that terrible day at the mansion. Stepping out of the patient's room, she saw Grace with Catherine, David's aunt, speaking to a nurse at the reception desk. "I specifically requested Dr. Henderson," Grace was saying, her voice sharp. "I understand she's new, but we've known her family for years." Rose stood there, clipboard pressed to her chest, as Grace turned and their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace grabbed Catherine's arm and hurried toward the elevator, as if Rose was carrying something contagious. That evening, as Rose recounted the story to David over dinner, her voice cracked. "Your mom would rather see a doctor fresh out of residency than let me anywhere near her." David pushed his plate away, appetite gone. "This has to stop. I'm going to talk to them." "David, don't," Rose pleaded. "It'll only make things worse." But David was already pulling out his phone, dialing his father's number. To their surprise, Richard answered. "Dad, we need to talk about this situation," David said, putting the phone on speaker. There was a long pause before Richard spoke. "Son, your mother and I have discussed this at length. We just want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" David's voice rose. "What's best for me is marrying the woman I love. Rose saves children's lives every day. She's kind, brilliant, and somehow still loves me despite how terribly our family has treated her. How can you not see that?" "It's not that simple, David," Richard sighed. "There are considerations." "Like what, Dad?" "Like what the country club members might think. Like how it might affect your business partnerships. Tell me, what considerations are worth throwing away your relationship with your only son?" The silence on the other end was deafening. "Your Aunt Catherine is hosting the annual family reunion next weekend," Richard finally said. "Perhaps if you both came, we could." "We're not coming to be put on display or judged," David cut in. "Either you accept us as we are, or you don't." But this halfway, behind-the-back whispering stops now. After hanging up, David and Rose sat in silence for a while. Finally, Rose spoke up. "You know what hurts the most? They haven't even tried to know me. Not once have they asked about my family, my work, my dreams. They took one look at my skin and decided that was all they needed to know." David pulled her close. "Then they're missing out on knowing the most amazing person I've ever met." That night, as they lay in bed, Rose's phone lit up with a message. It was from Jenny, David's cousin. "I'm sorry about my response earlier. The truth is, Mom said she'd cut me off if I attended the wedding. But I've been thinking, maybe it's time someone in this family stood up for what's right." Rose showed the message to David, a small spark of hope flickering in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, the walls were beginning to crack. But neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. As they were about to discover, sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom for people to finally open their eyes. And for the Anderson family, that moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. Instead of letting the rejection break their spirits, Rose and David decided to turn their wedding into something bigger than themselves. It began one morning over coffee as Rose scrolled through yet another declined invitation on her phone. "You know what?" she said, putting her phone down with newfound determination. "Maybe this isn't just about us anymore. Maybe this is our chance to show others that love doesn't see color." David looked up from his newspaper, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Well," Rose smiled, "remember Amy from the pediatric ward? Her wife's family refused to attend their wedding too. And remember that lovely couple we met at the park? They told us their families struggled with them being from different religions." David's eyes lit up, understanding where she was heading. "So instead of letting the empty chairs hurt us, we fill them with people who understand our journey," Rose finished. "People who know what it's like to choose love over prejudice." That evening, they started reaching out to their communities. Rose contacted her colleagues at the hospital, many of whom had their own stories of facing discrimination. David, who worked as a lawyer, reached out to clients he'd helped fight against discrimination over the years. The responses started pouring in, each more touching than the last. A young nurse wrote about how her parents had refused to accept her marriage to someone from a different culture. An elderly patient shared how, decades ago, his family had cut ties when he married someone from a different social class. As word spread about their wedding and the statement they were making, local community leaders began reaching out. The city's most respected civil rights activist, an elderly gentleman who'd marched for equality in his youth, called to offer his support. "Your love story," he told them, "is exactly what we fought for all those years ago." Even the local media caught wind of their story. A reporter from the city newspaper contacted them, wanting to share their journey. At first, Rose was hesitant about the publicity. "I don't want it to seem like we're doing this for attention," she told David one evening as they sat on their balcony. "We're not," he assured her. "We're showing others that they're not alone. Remember how you felt when Amy shared her story with you? Maybe our story could help someone else feel less alone." The article, when it came out, was beautiful. It didn't sensationalize their story, but focused on the larger message of love and acceptance. The reporter had interviewed several of their invited guests, each sharing their own experiences with prejudice and how they'd overcome it. The story quickly spread online, touching hearts across the city. Messages of support started flooding in from complete strangers. Some shared their own stories of family rejection, while others expressed how the article had opened their eyes to their own biases. One message particularly stood out. It was from a mother who wrote about how reading their story had made her reconsider her reaction to her own son's relationship. "I was being just like your fiancé's family," she admitted. "But your story made me realize I was about to lose my son over my own prejudices. Thank you for helping me see clearly." The warmth of community support began to fill the void left by David's family's rejection. Rose's hospital colleagues organized a stunning bridal shower, decorating the pediatric ward's break room with flowers and lights. The children she treated made her cards, their innocent hearts seeing nothing but the doctor who helped make them feel better. David's law firm partners, who had watched him fight for justice in the courtroom for years, stood firmly behind them. They offered their beautiful courtyard for the ceremony, a space usually reserved for high-profile events. One evening, as they worked on the seating arrangements, Rose noticed David getting emotional. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. "Nothing's wrong," he smiled through tears. "I just realized something. All these people coming to our wedding, they're not coming out of obligation or family duty. They're coming because they believe in love, real love, the kind that breaks down walls and changes hearts." Rose hugged him tight. "And look at how many of them there are. We thought we'd have empty chairs to fill, but now we might need to add more seats." The RSVPs continued to pour in, each one carrying a message of support and solidarity. A local choir offered to sing at their ceremony. A group of culinary students who'd heard their story wanted to bake their wedding cake. A well-known local photographer offered his services for free, saying their love story needed to be documented. What had started as a painful rejection had transformed into something beautiful, a celebration not just of their love, but of all love that dares to cross boundaries and challenge prejudices. But even as they threw themselves into creating this meaningful celebration, neither Rose nor David could have predicted the series of events that were about to unfold. Sometimes life has a way of teaching the hardest lessons to those who need them most, and for David's family, that lesson was coming in a way nobody could have anticipated. Instead of letting the rejection break their spirits, Rose and David decided to turn their wedding into something bigger than themselves. It began one morning over coffee as Rose scrolled through yet another declined invitation on her phone. "You know what?" she said, putting her phone down with newfound determination. "Maybe this isn't just about us anymore. Maybe this is our chance to show others that love doesn't see color." David looked up from his newspaper, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "Well," Rose smiled, "remember Amy from the pediatric ward? Her wife's family refused to attend their wedding too. And remember that lovely couple we met at the park? They told us their families struggled with them being from different religions." David's eyes lit up, understanding where she was heading. "So instead of letting their empty chairs hurt us, we fill them with people who understand our journey," Rose finished. "People who know what it's like to choose love over prejudice." That evening, they started reaching out to their communities. Rose contacted her colleagues at the hospital, many of whom had their own stories of facing discrimination. David, who worked as a lawyer, reached out to clients he helped fight against discrimination over the years. The responses started pouring in, each more touching than the last. A young nurse wrote about how her parents had refused to accept her marriage to someone from a different culture. An elderly patient shared how, decades ago, his family had cut ties when he married someone from a different social class. As word spread about their wedding and the statement they were making, local community leaders began reaching out. The city's most respected civil rights activist, an elderly gentleman who'd marched for equality in his youth, called to offer his support. "Your love story," he told them, "is exactly what we fought for all those years ago." Even the local media caught wind of their story. A reporter from the city newspaper contacted them, wanting to share their journey. At first, Rose was hesitant about the publicity. "I don't want it to seem like we're doing this for attention," she told David one evening as they sat on their balcony. "We're not," he assured her. "We're showing others that they're not alone. Remember how you felt when Amy shared her story with you? Maybe our story could help someone else feel less alone." The article, when it came out, was beautiful. It didn't sensationalize their story, but focused on the larger message of love and acceptance. The reporter had interviewed several of their invited guests, each sharing their own experiences with prejudice and how they'd overcome it. The story quickly spread online, touching hearts across the city. Messages of support started flooding in from complete strangers. Some shared their own stories of family rejection, while others expressed how the article had opened their eyes to their own biases. One message particularly stood out. It was from a mother who wrote about how reading their story had made her reconsider her reaction to her own son's relationship. "I was being just like your fiance's family," she admitted. "But your story made me realize I was about to lose my son over my own prejudices. Thank you for helping me see clearly." The warmth of community support began to fill the void left by David's family's rejection. Rose's hospital colleagues organized a stunning bridal shower, decorating the pediatric ward's break room with flowers and lights. The children she treated made her cards, their innocent hearts seeing nothing but the doctor who helped make them feel better. David's law firm partners, who had watched him fight for justice in the courtroom for years, stood firmly behind them. They offered their beautiful courtyard for the ceremony, a space usually reserved for high-profile events. One evening, as they worked on the seating arrangements, Rose noticed David getting emotional. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. "Nothing's wrong," he smiled through tears. "I just realized something. All these people coming to our wedding, they're not coming out of obligation or family duty. They're coming because they believe in love, real love, the kind that breaks down walls and changes hearts." Rose hugged him tight. "And look at how many of them there are. We thought we'd have empty chairs to fill, but now we might need to add more seats." The RSVPs continued to pour in, each one carrying a message of support and solidarity. A local choir offered to sing at their ceremony. A group of culinary students who'd heard their story wanted to bake their wedding cake. A well-known local photographer offered his services for free, saying their love story needed to be documented. The morning of the wedding dawned with a perfect blue sky, as if nature itself was blessing the day. Rose stood at the window of her bridal suite, watching the sun rise over the city. Her mother was behind her, carefully pinning small white flowers into her hair. "Look at all those people already gathering outside," her mother said softly. Indeed, the courtyard below was filling with guests, their voices carrying up like a gentle wave of support. Rose touched the window glass, remembering how different this day was from what she originally imagined. There would be no grand Anderson family mansion as a venue, no centuries-old family traditions to honor. Instead, they had created something entirely new and somehow even more meaningful. "I think this is better than anything we could have planned," Rose whispered, and her mother squeezed her shoulders in understanding. The bridal suite door opened, and in rushed Emmy, Rose's colleague from the pediatric ward, holding a tablet. "Rose, you have to see this. The local news is here, and people from all over the city are coming to show their support. There's even a group holding signs about love and acceptance outside." Rose walked over to look at the tablet, and her breath caught. The courtyard had transformed into a sea of colors and faces. Families of all backgrounds had gathered, many bringing flowers and handmade signs. One elderly couple held a sign that read, "Married 52 years, love knows no boundaries." Meanwhile, in the groom's room, David was adjusting his tie when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jenny, his cousin. "I'm here. Parked around the corner. Mom doesn't know. I couldn't miss this day." David's hands shook slightly as he replied, telling her which side entrance to use. His cousin's courage in defying her mother, David's Aunt Catherine, meant more than he could express. The ceremony space had been transformed into something magical. The law firm's courtyard, usually austere and formal, now bloomed with flowers in soft whites and blues. Instead of traditional straight rows of chairs, they had arranged them in a circle, symbolizing unity and inclusion. The old stone walls were draped with flowing fabric, and strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, ready to twinkle as day turned to evening. As the ceremony time approached, every seat filled. Where there might have been empty spaces left by David's family, there sat people whose own stories of love against odds had brought them here. The elderly civil rights activist sat in the front row, his weathered face beaming. Beside him sat some of Rose's young patients who had begged their parents to attend, their faces glowing with excitement to see their favorite doctor as a bride. The local choir took their places, their voices rising in a song about love and acceptance that brought tears to many eyes. Then, as the wedding march began, a hush fell over the gathering. David stood at the altar, his best friend by his side, watching as the crowd rose. His eyes found Jenny, sitting quietly near the back, dabbing at her eyes. Then Rose appeared, and the world seemed to stop. She was radiant in a simple, elegant dress that seemed to catch every ray of sunlight. Her father, walking beside her, couldn't stop smiling. But it was the joy on Rose's face that captured everyone's attention, pure, uncontained happiness that seemed to light up the entire courtyard. As they exchanged vows, their words carried across the hushed gathering. They spoke not just of their love for each other, but of their gratitude for everyone who had chosen to stand with them. David's voice cracked as he promised to always choose love over prejudice, to stand firm against hatred, and to build a future based on understanding and acceptance. Rose's vows spoke of resilience, of finding strength in adversity, and of how their challenged love had only grown stronger. "Our story," she said, her voice clear and strong, "isn't just about two people falling in love. It's about a community coming together to show that love is stronger than prejudice, that family isn't just about blood, but about who chooses to stand by you when it matters most." The ceremony culminated in a unique tradition they had created. Instead of a unity candle or sand ceremony, they invited everyone present to write a message of hope on small cards. These cards were collected in a beautiful glass container to be opened on their first anniversary, a time capsule of love and support from their chosen family. As they shared their first kiss as a married couple, the choir burst into song again, and the courtyard erupted in cheers. Rose and David turned to face their guests, hands clasped tight, and were met with a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old building. The celebration that followed was unlike any wedding reception the city had seen. The culinary students had outdone themselves with the cake, creating a stunning masterpiece decorated with hand-painted flowers. People who had arrived as strangers found themselves sharing tables and stories, forming connections that would last long beyond this day. But even as joy filled the courtyard, neither Rose nor David could have known that across town, an event was unfolding that would shake their world once again. Sometimes, the universe has its own ways of bringing about change, and the next chapter of their story was about to begin in the most unexpected way. 3 months after their wedding, life had settled into a new normal for Rose and David. The media attention had died down, and they were enjoying their quiet life together. Rose had thrown herself back into her work at the hospital, while David continued his law practice. The pain of his family's rejection was still there, but they'd learned to live with it. That Tuesday started like any other. Rose was halfway through her hospital shift when the emergency room buzzed with activity. Code blue in the ER crackled over the speakers. As the on-call surgeon, she rushed downstairs, pulling on her surgical gown as she ran. "What do we have?" she asked the ER nurse who met her at the doors. "Female patient, mid-60s, severe cardiac event. BP's dropping fast." "Wait," the nurse checked her clipboard and froze. "Dr. Rose, it's Grace Anderson." Rose's heart skipped a beat. Her mother-in-law, the woman who had refused to attend her wedding, who couldn't even look her in the eye at the supermarket. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. Then her medical training kicked in. "Prep or 3, she commended, her voice steady. "Get me her full stats and call cardiology for backup." As they rushed Grace into surgery, Rose caught a glimpse of her face. The usually perfectly composed woman looked pale and vulnerable, her carefully styled hair messy against the hospital pillow. Their eyes met briefly, and Rose saw something she'd never seen before in Grace's expression: fear. "It's going to be okay," Rose said softly, giving her hand a quick squeeze before the anesthesia took effect. "I've got you." The next 6 hours were intense. Grace's heart kept trying to give out, but Rose refused to give up. Her hands moved with precision and skill, her mind focused solely on saving a life. Not her mother-in-law who had rejected her, but simply a patient who needed her help. Outside in the waiting room, David paced nervously. He'd rushed from court when he got the call, and now found himself in the strange position of putting his mother's life in the hands of the woman she had shunned. His father Richard sat rigidly in a corner chair, looking lost without Grace by his side. "David," Richard spoke up suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Will she do her best?" Even after everything. David stopped pacing and looked at his father in disbelief. "Dad, Rose took an oath to save lives. She doesn't care about skin color or family drama when someone's on her operating table. That's who she is. That's who you refuse to get to know." Richard fell silent, staring at his hands. Hour after hour passed. Other family members arrived. Aunt Catherine, Cousin Jenny, even Grace's Bridge Club friends. The waiting room filled with the very people who had boycotted the wedding, now united in anxiety over Grace's fate. Finally, Rose emerged from surgery, still in her scrubs, looking tired but composed. Everyone stood up at once. "She's stable," Rose announced, maintaining her professional tone. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but she made it through surgery successfully. We managed to clear the blockage and repair the damage. She's being moved to recovery now." The relief in the room was palpable. Richard's legs seemed to give out, and he sank back into his chair. Aunt Catherine dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "When can we see her?" Jenny asked softly. "One person at a time, in about an hour," Rose replied. "She needs rest, but short visits should be fine." She turned to leave, her job done. "Wait," Richard called out. Rose paused at the door. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking, "for saving my wife." Rose nodded quietly and left the room. She made it to her office before the emotions hit her. David found her there a few minutes later, sitting at her desk, finally letting the tears fall. "Hey," he said softly, pulling her into a hug. "You did it. You saved her." "I was so scared, David," she whispered. "Not of the surgery. I've done hundreds of those. I was scared that if anything went wrong, they'd think." "That you didn't try your best because of how they treated you," he finished. "But that never even crossed your mind in there, did it?" Rose shook her head. "She was just my patient, someone who needed help." Later that evening, as Grace slept in recovery, Richard sat by her bedside, lost in thought. He watched as Rose came in to check Grace's vitals, her movements gentle and professional. He noticed how she adjusted Grace's pillow with care, how she double-checked every reading. What hit him hardest was realizing that Rose had shown more genuine care for Grace in those few hours than any of the socially acceptable people they'd surrounded themselves with for years. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by beeping machines, something began to shift in Richard's heart. But the real change was yet to come. When Grace would finally wake up, her world would be different in more ways than one. The woman who had turned her back on her son's happiness was about to learn the most profound lesson of her life, and it would start with opening her eyes to see the face of the daughter-in-law she had rejected, now wearing a doctor's coat and a gentle smile, checking her charts with unwavering dedication. The morning after the surgery, Grace slowly opened her eyes to find herself in a hospital room. The first thing she noticed was the gentle beeping of machines, and then she saw her husband Richard asleep in a chair nearby, looking older than she'd ever seen him. A soft knock at the door made her turn her head. There stood Rose in her white doctor's coat, holding a medical chart. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Grace truly saw her daughter-in-law, not as a threat to her family's social standing, but as the skilled professional who had saved her life. "Good morning," Rose said warmly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "How are you feeling?" Grace's throat felt dry. I'm alive," she whispered. "Yes, you are," Rose smiled, checking the monitors. "The surgery went well. You gave us quite a scare, but you're strong." As Rose checked her vitals, Grace watched her movements. Confident, gentle, careful. She remembered fragments from before the surgery, the moment their eyes had met, and Rose's reassuring words. "I've got you." Richard stirred in his chair and woke up. Seeing Grace awake, he rushed to her side, tears in his eyes. "Grace, honey." "I'll give you some time together," Rose said, turning to leave. "Wait," Grace called out, her voice still weak. "Thank you for saving my life." Rose paused at the door. "It's my job," she said simply, but her eyes held something deeper, compassion, understanding, and perhaps a hint of hope. Over the next few days, news of what had happened spread through the Anderson family like wildfire. Aunt Catherine, who had been the most vocal opponent of Rose and David's marriage, was particularly shaken. She sat in her large empty house, staring at old family photos, her worldview crumbling around her. The family's social circle was buzzing with the story. The same people who had whispered disapproving comments about David's choice of bride were now talking about how Dr. Rose Anderson had performed a miraculous surgery to save her mother-in-law's life. Jenny, who had secretly attended the wedding, became more vocal in her support. "Don't you see?" She challenged her mother at a family gathering. While we were all busy judging her, Rose was becoming the kind of person who would save the life of someone who rejected her. What does that say about her, and what does it say about us? Grace's recovery room became an unexpected space for transformation. Each day, Rose would come in to check on her, and gradually, their interactions began to change. It started with small things. Grace asking about Rose's medical training, Rose sharing stories about her most challenging surgeries. One afternoon, Grace found herself asking, "How did you know you wanted to be a doctor?" Rose sat down at the edge of the bed, surprised by the personal question. "I was 7 when my grandfather had a heart attack," she shared. "The doctors saved him, gave me 6 more years with him. I wanted to do that for other families." Grace felt tears welling up. "My father, he died of a heart attack. Nobody could help him in time." For a moment, they sat in understanding silence. Two women, connected by loss and healing, seeing each other as human beings perhaps for the first time. Meanwhile, Richard had been doing some soul-searching of his own. He found himself in David's office at the law firm one afternoon, looking more uncertain than his son had ever seen him. "Your mother's doctor called," Richard said, sitting heavily in a chair. He said if Rose hadn't acted as quickly and skillfully as she did, he couldn't finish the sentence. David waited, letting his father process his thoughts. "We were wrong, son," Richard finally said, his voice breaking. "So terribly wrong. We let our prejudices blind us to what truly matters. We almost lost your mother, and we've been losing you. All because we couldn't see past our own biases." Aunt Catherine's transformation was perhaps the most surprising. After visiting Grace in the hospital and witnessing Rose's care firsthand, she called an emergency family meeting. But this time, it was different. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she announced to the gathered family members. "We've prided ourselves on being pillars of society, on maintaining certain standards. But what standards are those, really? Judging people by their skin color instead of their character. Rejecting a woman who just saved Grace's life because she doesn't fit our narrow view of what's acceptable." The room was silent as Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've been wrong. We've all been wrong. And it's time we admitted it." Back in the hospital, Grace was making progress, both physically and emotionally. One evening, as Rose was finishing her rounds, Grace reached for her hand. "I have some old photo albums at home," Grace said softly. "Pictures of David growing up. Would you like to see them sometime?" Rose felt her heart skip a beat. "I'd like that very much," she replied. That night, Rose told David about the conversation. He held her close, both of them emotional. "It's not going to be perfect right away," Rose said. "There's still a lot of healing to do." "But it's a start," David replied. "A real start." Word of the Anderson family's transformation spread through their social circles, causing ripples of change. Some old family friends who had supported their prejudices now found themselves questioning their own beliefs. The story of the doctor who saved her mother-in-law's life despite being rejected by the family touched hearts and opened minds. But the most profound change was yet to come. As Grace prepared to leave the hospital, she made a decision that would surprise everyone. A decision that would show just how completely her heart had changed. 1 year after the wedding that her family had refused to attend, Grace stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from emotion. Today was special. "Are you ready?" Richard asked, appearing in the doorway. He looked dapper in his new suit. "Almost," Grace replied, touching the scar on her chest, a reminder of the surgery that had changed everything. "I just want everything to be perfect." Across town, Rose and David were getting ready too. Rose held up the invitation that had arrived 3 weeks ago, still hardly believing it was real. Written in Grace's elegant handwriting, it read, "Please join us for a celebration of love and family, a wedding anniversary renewal." The venue was the Anderson family mansion, the same place where Rose had first met Grace and Richard, where she faced their initial rejection. But today, the grand old house was transformed. Fresh flowers filled every room, and photographs lined the entrance hall, pictures of Rose and David's original wedding that Grace had gotten from the local newspaper, mixed with family photos from both sides. As guests began to arrive, it was clear this wasn't just an anniversary party, it was a statement. Grace had invited everyone, the entire Anderson family, their social circle, even the people who had supported their prejudices. She wanted them all to witness this day. Rose's parents arrived first, looking a bit nervous, but Grace rushed to greet them, hugging Rose's mother warmly. "Thank you for sharing your daughter with our family," she said, tears in her eyes. "We didn't deserve her, but we're learning to." Aunt Catherine was there too, but not as the stern family matriarch she'd once been. She moved through the crowd, making sure Rose's family felt welcomed, introducing them to others not as David's wife's family, but as our family. The local newspaper reporter who had covered their wedding was also present, invited by Grace herself. "This story needs an ending," Grace had told her, or rather, a new beginning. When Rose and David arrived, the entire gathering fell silent. Grace walked forward, taking both of Rose's hands in hers. "A year ago," Grace began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let prejudice blind me to the amazing person my son had chosen to spend his life with. I missed one of the most important days of his life because I couldn't see past the color of his bride's skin." She turned to address the gathered crowd. "Many of you supported our prejudices. Some of you even encouraged them. Today, I want you to see what I finally see. A brilliant doctor, a loving wife, and the daughter I almost lost the chance to know." Richard stepped forward, standing beside his wife. "We're hosting this anniversary celebration, not just to make up for missing the wedding, but to make a public declaration. Love doesn't see color. Family isn't about matching skin tones, it's about hearts that beat in harmony." The ceremony that followed was both a renewal of vows and a renewal of family bonds. Rose and David stood in the garden where they'd once faced rejection, but this time surrounded by both their families, united at last. Grace had arranged everything: the flowers, the music, even the cake. But the most touching moment came during the speeches. When I was lying in that hospital bed, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion, I realized something. The woman I had rejected as not good enough for my family had held my life in her hands and fought to save me, not because of who I was, but because of who she is. That's the moment I understood what real character looks like. The celebration lasted well into the evening. The Anderson mansion, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a place of healing and unity. Children from both families played together in the garden, their laughter a promise of a better future. As the sun began to set, Grace gathered everyone for a final surprise. She unveiled a large family portrait, not the formal, stiff photographs the Andersons were known for, but a warm, candid shot of both families together, taken during the celebration. This, she announced, is going right above the fireplace, because this is what family looks like. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Rose found herself alone with Grace in the kitchen. Thank you, Rose said softly, not just for today, but for being brave enough to change. Grace hugged her tightly. No, thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to. The story made the local news again, but this time with a different headline. Local families' journey from prejudice to understanding inspires community change. 6 months later, Grace and Rose started a foundation together, helping other families bridge racial and cultural divides. They shared their story at community gatherings, not to shame anyone, but to show that change is possible when hearts are open to love. And when Rose and David welcomed their first child the following year, it was Grace who was there in the delivery room, holding her daughter-in-law's hand, tears of joy streaming down her face as she welcomed her first grandchild into a family that had learned the true meaning of love. The old saying goes that love conquers all, but what their story showed was that sometimes love does more than conquer. It transforms, it heals, and it builds bridges that prejudice once burned. Their journey from rejection to acceptance became a beacon of hope for others, proving that it's never too late to open your heart and change your mind.